Hello everyone, it's Jan Bedell, the Little Giant Steps Brain Coach. Welcome back to this week's Brain Coach tip. I want to thank you for coming. You can help to reverse the curse that seems to be on our land of ever-increasing learning struggles and disabilities. It's our goal to get the word out about this life-changing effects of the NeuroDevelopmental Approach for life and equip families with information to release their children's full potential. Please help us with this goal by sharing the braincoachtips.com address with someone you know. Be sure to check out the many free articles and tremendous resources at our sponsor, littlegiantsteps.com. I'm privileged to have someone very special join us today. This is a colleague and a good friend of mine, Ruth Young. Welcome, Ruth.
Thanks for letting me join, Dr. Jan.
I just want to tell you a little bit about Ruth. She's a certified teacher in Texas and helped to start one of the first university model schools. If you don't know what that is, it's where they go to school 2 days and they're homeschooled the other 3 days. She also homeschooled all 5 of her children at one time or another in their school career. Not to mention all of those things, she's been a NeuroDevelopmentalist with us for the last 14 years. She's a pastor's wife of 37 years, and she's an author of many of the articles on the NeuroDevelopmental Approach that we have on the Little Giant Steps website. She's also written a great study guide called Release from Fear. We're going to tell you more about that in a little bit. So Ruth, I just thought as an introduction, I would ask you why you became a NeuroDevelopmentalist.
Well, it all happened with one of my children who did one of your programs, Jan, and at the end of 4 months, she came up a whole year in reading and a whole year in math. We hadn't done anything unusually different in reading or math. And she also improved a whole 2 years in auditory processing. And it had to have been the program and that her brain was working better. And I thought to myself, I've never seen any child come that far that fast with any program I'd ever seen in my 15 years of teaching at that point. I said, I'm going to switch careers and learn about neurodevelopment, and here I am today.
And we're so glad you're part of our team. You're an integral part. Today we're going to be talking about the subject of trauma. You might be surprised at some of the things that the brain actually interprets as trauma. We're going to list a few of these things. Some of them are going to be common to you. You would have thought that, and some may be very unusual. Some things that cause trauma to an individual would be something obvious like a car accident. Maybe not so obvious is divorce. And there's also,
watching violence on TV could cause trauma.
Oh, you're right about that. There could be abuse, neglect, even an extended illness.
Do you know, Dr. Jan, that if a child is separated from his or her mother before age 2, that is considered a trauma?
That's true. And also, I don't know if you've ever thought of this, but fever, a high fever, can be trauma to the brain. And the brain has certain reactions that it has. Its number one job is to stay alive. So it's going to do things to itself to be able to stay alive. And those things are pretty negative as far as function for the individual. Now, I have a personal story about a trauma. It was my brother that experienced a trauma. When he was 6 years old, he had to have heart surgery, and they had to hold him down. There were sounds and lights and all these kind of things that just really disoriented him and traumatized him. And even to this day, when he goes to the doctor, it's just a very negative thing. And unfortunately, he's had to have a couple of other heart surgeries since then. And that childhood memory just comes right back to the surface, just makes him totally illogical in his thinking. And so his brain was really traumatized as that little 6-year-old boy. But the good news is, we found some things that can help that. I mean, God, for one thing, but when we talked about abuse, that was in our list. One of the reasons I wanted you to be here is because of your experience, unfortunately, as a victim of trauma as a child growing up, and also some things that have helped you. So can you tell us a little bit about your story of abuse?
Yes, my daddy molested me from before I could talk until the age of 13. After which time I told my mom, and she never left me alone with him again, ever again. But when I was little, he would put me to bed, and instead of putting his hands together to pray for me or to teach me how to pray, I never got a prayer. Those hands went where they didn't belong. And that opened doors to a host of negative and perverted thoughts that would come into my mind. And when I got older, my mama taught ESL classes, that's English as a second language, 2 nights a week. And even when it was long past the time he should be putting me to bed, he was still doing these terrible things. And I grew to be a compliant child, but very angry on the inside. And I didn't want to dishonor my mom or my dad, so I internalized my anger. So it was like a lot of self-flagellation as a teenager. And then I entered adulthood as an emotional cripple. So it was a traumatic childhood for sure.
I just can't even imagine. Well, as a neurodevelopmentalist, you had to do a neurodevelopmental program as part of your training, right? You had to, I mean, we want the neurodevelopmentalists to be as good as they can be, have their brain functioning the best. But we had some interesting and what I thought at the time, because I hadn't experienced this before, some unusual results from you doing your program. Can you share that with us?
Yes. I want to continue and tell you that I sought counseling for the anger and actually got some help to heal. Over the years, I went to prayer therapy and psychologists, some deliverance, and even I worked with Dr. Gladney at Emotional Wellness Incorporated. But it wasn't until I did the neurodevelopmental program that it actually physically rebuilt the pathways in my brain that had been destroyed by that wash of cortisol, which is a chemical produced in the times of trauma.
So that's what I was talking about, where the brain actually does something to itself to destroy pathways or destroy part of itself, its function. But it's the whole purpose of that is to stay alive in the midst of trauma.
Right. And when I would do the cross pattern exercises, for example, we were rebuilding those connections that had been seared by that cortisol chemicals. And as my pathways were rebuilt, I remember, for example, you mentioned I had 5 children. Well, I took good care of those 5 children and fed them and clothed them and took them to swim practice and everything. But it wasn't until after I'd done the neurodevelopmental program that I began to experience feelings of nostalgia or empathy or sentimental feelings. They were new. I'd never had them before.
Wow. Things that we would just take for granted as being part of our feelings every day.
As a mother, even. Yes. So I just am so very grateful for the neurodevelopmental approach helping me heal.
Well, I have a story about that. I don't know that we listed in the list of things that cause trauma, but adoption is definitely a trauma to a person. It's rejection and abandonment that comes into their little spirit, even if it's in the womb, and they're handed off from the birth mother to the adopted mother right there in the delivery room. There's still trauma in that child's life. So a lot of families did a talk about this not too long ago that said, why isn't love enough with adoption? And I think it comes back to this trauma and the disconnect that the brain has because of that cortisol wash from the trauma. Well, we had a little boy that I worked with. He was 8 years old. His name was Sam, and he had a lot of anxiety. He had been adopted at 2.5 years old from a Russian orphanage. And he had this real fear of being left alone. His mom had to be in sight all the time. And so if you want to hear more about that story, it's in number 34, Adoption Isn't Love Enough, that I tell that full story. But bottom line is, after doing an intense program of the part of the brain that gets that cortisol wash, the pons area, that kind of makes the disconnect, he had done that for about 4 months, and he was able to verbalize, Mom, you just don't understand. When I was little, I would cry and nobody came. And so it's really interesting how those things came together after he had done the neurodevelopmental program to help rebuild those pathways. And the counselor was just elated at what could happen. So it sounds like to me some of that happened to you too.
Yes, when the pathways rebuild, then you can get better connected inside of yourself and with other people.
And one thing I've noticed about you over the years after you've had this experience with neurodevelopment is that you started, with us being really good friends, I see you a lot, and I've seen that you start to notice things around you more than you did before.
That's interesting that you say that. Yes, it's like my life turned from black and white to color. I mean, I started noticing flowers. I started noticing a lot of things I never even thought about before.
Yes, that's really interesting. Now, Little Giant Steps has products that, like the Developmental Foundations, that has these foundational kinds of exercises that happen to rebuild the brain. And Developmental Foundations is for 7-year-olds and older. And I just wanted to see if you would share your thoughts about Developmental Foundations.
I would highly recommend Developmental Foundations for any family who has a child or adult involved who's experienced trauma, because it's a really good first step in addressing the physical neural pathways in the brain and helping them get connected. One piece of advice I would add to doing the Developmental Foundations program is to be supportive of the child or the adult doing the program, because do you remember Susan Scott? She had trauma when she was a child in the hospital. When she was just 18 months and had to be left there, and her mom and dad couldn't be with her during those nights. And when she was an adult, she did a program, and she said that every time she got down on the floor to do the army crawl, she would cry. And then when she would get up, she would stop crying. So it was like an emotional connection that she wasn't able to cry for years and years. Now she could. And it was a healing cry, but it was interesting that it reconnected her at that level where she needed the healing.
And it just seems so strange that something like that would do that, but we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God has a way for us to regenerate those pathways because He knew there was going to be tribulation in this world. And so it seems strange that would be something that would do that, but it really does make that much difference.
It's important for the person, the child or the adult, to be supported emotionally and spiritually while they're doing the Developmental Foundations program for the physical healing.
Now, if the child is younger than 7, we recommend the activities in Early Learning Foundations. It also has a math component, but the neurodevelopment is what's really going to help those children that have had any trauma. And if they need a more individualized program, if there's behavior issues or other issues that may be getting them a label, or they have a syndrome or something like that, then we're going to recommend Jumpstart, which is the more individualized for them, exactly the activities that they would need. Ruth, I mentioned earlier about your devotional Release from Fear that you've created, and I just wondered who is the best suited for that particular program.
Yes, Jan, I wrote a book called Release from Fear. It's an ebook, and it's designed for 40 days, and it's best for teens and adults.
Okay, so that doesn't really have the neurodevelopment in it, but it has your years of experience going through this trauma and also being a pastor's wife and being grounded in the Word. So it really combines the wisdom that you have in there, not necessarily the neurodevelopment, but we just want to make sure everybody knows about that resource because it's so vital that you work with the spirit, soul, and body when you're recovering from trauma. Do you have any specifics about how this particular guide might be helpful for that age group, teens and adults, for overcoming the effects of trauma?
With trauma comes fear. It just happens. You get triggered continually or often, like a smoke alarm that just goes off with the least little provocation. And that fear is a problem. It just causes anxiety. And so I wrote the book because the Bible has a lot to say about fear. 365 times it mentions don't do it. So obviously we weren't built to carry fear or be fearful. We're told not to. And so because the truth will set you free, I thought it was very valuable to learn some of those scriptures and get that within my own spirit and share that with others.
Yes, I think it's a really valuable thing. And you can get your study guide at littlegiantsteps.com at the store. Just look for Release from Fear, and you can get that download there for that ebook. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but it's been great to visit with you, Ruth, and all of you out there. I hope you will stay tuned where you will receive more Brain Coach tips to make life and learning easier. In the meantime, please visit our sponsor, littlegiantsteps.com. They are dedicated to equipping you as parents so that your child can make the progress you're looking for. I also want to encourage you to take in more of the previous podcasts that can help you understand your children better, whether they are typically developing, gifted, or if they're struggling learners. Remember, neurodevelopment is a dynamic approach to life at any age. So think differently. The solution is not in the problem. Until next week, it's the Brain Coach signing off.